In the courtroom of Judge Adrian Hale, justice is swift and detached until the day Lyra Carter storms in. At just 12 years old, Lyra is bold, sharp, and unapologetically defiant, challenging everything Adrian believes about his life and work. Her claim? That her late mother, Sarah Carter, the woman Adrian once loved but lost, always believed he was her father. Caught between his duty to the law and his longing to uncover the truth, Adrian begins a journey that will take him deep into Sarah's troubled past and Lyra's harsh present. But the answers he seeks are far from simple. As secrets unravel and new threats arise, Adrian must decide whether he is willing to fight for a child who may not be his by blood but who desperately needs a place to belong. Heartbreaking and uplifting, The Echo of Belonging is a story of redemption, trust, and the ties that make a family, even when they seem impossible. Will Adrian and Lyra's bond survive the truth, or will it shatter under the weight of their pasts? Adrian Hale's courtroom buzzed with the low hum of routine cases. The room had seen many foster care hearings, all blending into one predictable rhythm. Adrian, seated high above the room at his bench, kept his face impassive as yet another social worker recounted the familiar details of a child's turbulent life in the system. And that brings us to our next case, Your Honor, the bailiff announced, Lyra Carter, age 12. At the mention of the name, Adrian's eyes flickered to the case file before him. Lyra Carter. The name sparked something in him, tugging at the edges of a distant memory. He opened the file, and as he scanned the first few lines, his hand faltered for just a moment. Sarah Carter. A name he hadn't thought of in years. He quickly regained his composure, but the ripple of unease had already begun. The door to the courtroom swung open, and in walked a small girl. She was petite, her wild auburn curls framing a face that appeared both defiant and weary beyond her years. Dressed in a mismatched outfit that spoke of hand-me-downs, Lyra's pale green eyes scanned the room, landing on Adrian with a sharp, unwavering stare. Adrian watched her in silence as she approached the stand. There was something unnervingly familiar about the way she carried herself. She didn't shuffle timidly like many of the other children. She moved with purpose, a determination that belied her young age. Miss Carter, Adrian began, keeping his tone neutral, I understand you're here to contest your placement. Lyra sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Yeah, she replied. Her voice was steady, though her expression remained guarded. I've been bounced around enough. None of those places are home. Adrian felt a pang in his chest at her words. He kept his gaze on her, curious despite himself. He had seen many children in her situation, but Lyra was different. She was familiar. The social worker began the usual report, detailing Lyra's troubled history with foster homes, her behavior issues, her refusal to adapt. Lyra sat still, but the tension was palpable. Finally, when the social worker started listing the potential homes, Lyra snapped. That's not the whole story, she said, her voice cutting through the air. Adrian raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. Lyra crossed her arms, her eyes hardening. They keep talking about me like I'm just a problem to be fixed or passed around. But I have a right to know where I came from, about my mom. Adrian leaned forward slightly, now fully focused on her. What do you want to know about your mother? Lyra hesitated for just a second, then looked him squarely in the eye. She used to talk about someone. About you. She said you were someone important to her. She said you might be my father. The words hung in the air like an accusation. For the first time in years, Adrian felt the courtroom walls closing in on him. The stillness in the room was deafening. He blinked, stunned, his mind racing through fragmented memories of Sarah. He stared at the girl, his voice quieter now. What did your mother tell you? Lyra's gaze didn't waver. She said you were the only man she ever loved. During the recess, Adrian retreated to his chambers, his heart pounding harder than he'd like to admit. He closed the door behind him and sank into his chair, pressing his hands to his face. Sarah. It had been over a decade since he last saw her. What had become of her life? He remembered her vividly now, the laughter, the spark of her creativity, the way she could light up a room without trying. Their relationship had been brief but intense. And yet, for reasons he never fully understood, they had drifted apart. He had told himself it was because of his career, because they wanted different things. But deep down, he knew it was because he was afraid of what she represented. A future he wasn't ready for. And now, this girl, Lyra, had appeared out of nowhere, throwing his carefully structured life into disarray. Could she really be his daughter? The thought was almost too much to process. But as he replayed Lyra's words in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had left him a message, one he had ignored for too long. When the hearing resumed, the room felt different. Adrian had regained his composure, but there was a new tension in the air. The social worker finished her report, but Adrian was barely listening. His eyes kept drifting toward Lyra, who sat quietly, her arms crossed and her gaze far away. "Miss Carter," he said finally, "I'm going to take some time to review this case more thoroughly. We'll reconvene in a week's time." Lyra nodded, but as she stood to leave, she turned and met his eyes one last time. There was something in her expression, something unspoken but powerful. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was hope. Adrian felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had spent years distancing himself from emotional entanglements, from the past. But now, for the first time in a long time, he wondered if he had been wrong to keep those walls up. As Lyra left the courtroom, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far from over. And that perhaps, for both of them, the real trial was just beginning. Adrian sat at his desk late into the night, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across his office. Before him lay a stack of old court records, each one a piece of Sarah Carter's story that he had somehow missed over the years. He scrolled through the case logs on his computer, his eyes heavy but determined. The name Sarah Carter appeared again and again. He had to know what had happened to her after they parted ways. With each record, Adrian pieced together fragments of Sarah's final years, the financial troubles, the medical bills, and the eventual placement of her daughter into the foster system after her death. How had she slipped through the cracks like this? And why hadn't she reached out to him? His mind was a storm of questions, but one thing was clear: Lyra's claim that Sarah had spoken of him wasn't a random cry for attention. Sarah must have kept him in her heart, even as their lives diverged. Adrian pushed away from his desk and rubbed his temples. He had always been meticulous with his cases, but this was personal. His connection to Lyra, even if uncertain, was real. The thought weighed heavily on him. He had spent so long isolating himself, burying himself in the law, that he never stopped to question if someone still needed him. Now, that thought refused to leave him alone. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. He had court in the morning, but sleep wouldn't come easy. Not until he uncovered the truth about Lyra and Sarah. The next morning, Adrian requested a private meeting with Lyra and her social worker. The cramped meeting room was much less imposing than the courtroom, yet Lyra sat with the same guarded expression, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Thanks for agreeing to this," Adrian said as he sat down, keeping his tone measured. He glanced at the social worker, Miss Carter, who nodded silently. Adrian turned back to Lyra, his gaze softening. "I wanted to talk to you, Lyra. About your mother," he said, watching carefully for her reaction. "You mentioned in court that she spoke about me." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, she did," she said flatly. "She said you were important to her." Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table between them. "Why didn't she ever contact me? Do you know why she didn't reach out?" Lyra shrugged, her expression hardening. "I dunno. Maybe she thought you didn't care. Maybe she was right." Her words hit harder than Adrian had expected. He let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her accusation. "That's not true," Adrian said quietly. "I cared about your mother. More than you know." Lyra gave him a skeptical look. "So, why'd you leave her then? If you cared so much?" Adrian paused, caught off guard by her bluntness. How could he explain to a 12-year-old the complexities of his relationship with Sarah? That he had been scared of love, of commitment, of what it meant to be vulnerable again after losing so much. But Lyra wouldn't understand that. Maybe she didn't need to. I didn't leave her because I didn't care, Adrian said after a moment. We were just in different places in our lives. Lyra rolled her eyes. Sounds like a lame excuse. Adrian couldn't help but smile at her defiance, even though it stung. It probably does. Miss Carter, the social worker, cleared her throat softly and reached into her briefcase. There's something I thought might help this conversation, she said, pulling out an old photograph and sliding it across the table toward Adrian. Adrian picked up the photo and stared at it. It was a picture of Sarah, smiling brightly, with a much younger Lyra in her arms. They looked happy, radiantly so. Adrian's chest tightened as he stared at Sarah's face, unchanged in his memories. Even after all these years, she looked the same as the day they had parted ways. She gave me this just before, Lyra's voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard. Before she got sick. Adrian glanced up at Lyra, noting the vulnerability in her expression for the first time. She had been hiding it well, but this conversation was clearly stirring up emotions she wasn't prepared to face. You look like her, Adrian said softly, placing the photo back on the table. Lyra's eyes flicked to the picture, but she quickly looked away. So what? Lyra muttered, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Doesn't change anything. Adrian could hear the bitterness in her voice, and it struck him how much this girl had endured in her short life. She had lost her mother, been shuffled around in the foster system, and now she was facing the possibility that the man she thought might be her father wasn't interested. It was no wonder she was angry. It changes everything, Adrian said gently. I need to know the truth. About your mother, and about us. Lyra glared at him, her eyes flashing with mistrust. And if I'm not your daughter? What then? The tension in the room was palpable. Adrian hesitated for a moment, knowing that his next words would shape whatever came next between them. I want to find out for sure, Adrian said, his voice steady but soft. If you're willing, we can take a paternity test. That way, we'll know the truth. Lyra's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her fingers drumming on the table. And what if it comes back saying you're not my father, she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. You'll just go back to your perfect little life and forget all about me, right? Adrian shook his head. No. No matter what the test says, I'm not going to forget about you. I made a promise to your mother a long time ago, even if I didn't realize it at the time. I don't break promises. Lyra eyed him warily, her defenses still firmly in place. People always say that. Then they leave. Adrian leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. I'm not leaving, Lyra. Not this time. There was a long silence as Lyra considered his words. She finally gave a small, reluctant nod. Fine. Do the test. But don't make promises you can't keep, okay? Adrian nodded. I won't. Later that day, after Lyra and Miss Carter had left, Adrian sat alone in his office, staring at the DNA test request form. It sat there on his desk, a simple piece of paper that could change everything or nothing. His mind raced with the possibilities, but the uncertainty didn't shake him as much as it might have a few days ago. He had spent so much of his life avoiding emotional entanglements, running from the pain of loss. But Lyra, she had stirred something in him. The possibility that she might be his daughter had awakened a part of him he thought was long gone. And even if the test came back negative, Adrian knew he couldn't walk away now. He picked up the form and signed his name at the bottom, sealing his decision. Whatever the test revealed, Adrian was prepared to face it. Whether Lyra was his biological daughter or not, he would find a way to be there for her. As he folded the paper and slipped it into the envelope, Adrian's thoughts returned to Sarah, her bright smile, her laughter, the warmth she had brought into his life so briefly. He had let her slip away once. He wouldn't make the same mistake with Lyra. He had made a promise. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian felt certain of one thing: he wasn't going to break it. The morning air in Adrian's office felt heavy with anticipation as the technician prepared the materials for the DNA test. Lyra sat stiffly in one of the leather chairs across from Adrian's desk, her arms crossed as she watched the sterile process with narrowed eyes. She didn't speak, didn't fidget, just stared, her gaze cold and distant. Adrian sat quietly beside her, his mind churning with thoughts. The sterile swabs, the paperwork, and the quiet efficiency of the technician only amplified the weight of what they were doing. This simple test could decide so much. "Just a swab of the inside of your cheek, and we'll be done," the technician said, his voice polite but detached. Lyra rolled her eyes but opened her mouth when prompted, glaring at Adrian out of the corner of her eye. The technician finished quickly, and soon it was Adrian's turn. He leaned forward as the swab brushed the inside of his cheek, the brief moment feeling deeply personal, despite the technician's indifferent attitude. Once the samples were collected, the technician stood. "Results should be ready in about a week," he said, handing Adrian a final form to sign. "Thank you," Adrian replied, his voice low. He watched as the technician left the office, leaving the two of them in tense silence. Lyra didn't move right away. She stared at the desk, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she finally spoke. "It won't change anything, you know," she said, her tone flat. "Even if it says you're not my dad, I'll still be stuck." Adrian looked at her carefully. "You won't be stuck, Lyra," he said gently. "We'll figure this out, no matter what the results say." Lyra's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment, Adrian saw a flash of something in them: fear, vulnerability, maybe even hope, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "We'll see," she muttered, standing up abruptly and heading for the door without another word. Adrian watched her go, a sinking feeling in his chest. The process was sterile, but the stakes were personal. And as he sat there, the weight of what the test results could mean settled heavily on his shoulders. The next few days felt like an eternity as Adrian waited for the results. The test might have provided a scientific answer, but it wouldn't give him what he truly needed: answers about Sarah's life and why she hadn't reached out to him. With Lyra's story haunting his every thought, Adrian found himself drawn deeper into the archives. Sarah's life was there, in bits and pieces, scattered throughout case files and records. He spent hours combing through old court documents, social services records, and hospital bills, anything that could provide a clue to what had happened to her. One afternoon, as Adrian was poring over another set of records, he came across something he hadn't expected: letters. They were in the back of one of the files from Sarah's final years, tucked away between forms. Adrian's heart pounded as he carefully unfolded the pages. They were addressed to him, though they had never been sent. His name was written in Sarah's familiar handwriting, and as he began to read, the memories came flooding back. "Adrian, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know." The letter detailed her struggles, the illness that had taken over her life, her worries for Lyra, and her regret at not having reached out to Adrian sooner. She had been scared, she admitted. Scared that he had moved on, that he wouldn't care about her anymore. But as her illness worsened, she realized she needed to do something, not for herself, but for Lyra. In the final letter, Sarah wrote, "I don't know what the future holds for Lyra, but I do know one thing: she deserves better than this. She deserves someone who can love her the way you loved me. I've made mistakes, Adrian, but my biggest one was not telling you sooner. I hope, in the end, you can forgive me. And I hope, if nothing else, that you'll be there for her when I no longer can." Adrian set the letter down, his throat tight. Sarah had wanted him to be a part of Lyra's life, even after all these years. But the system had failed her. The letters had been lost, buried in the bureaucracy, and now he was only finding them when it was almost too late. He sat back, his mind racing. No matter what the DNA test revealed, Adrian knew he had to be there for Lyra. Sarah had trusted him, even if she hadn't reached out directly. He couldn't let her down now. A few days later, Adrian decided it was time to visit Lyra at her foster home. He wanted to see the environment she was living in, to understand what her daily life was like. When he arrived at the address, he was struck by the bleakness of the house. It was an aging building, its walls peeling, the yard overgrown. The windows were clouded with grime, and as Adrian knocked on the door, he felt a growing sense of unease. The foster mother, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, opened the door and gave Adrian a cursory glance before inviting him in. Inside, the house was just as worn as the exterior, cramped and cluttered, with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of mildew. It wasn't exactly a place of neglect, but it was clear that this was just another stop on Lyra's journey through the system. Lyra was sitting in the corner of the small living room, her knees pulled up to her chest as she stared at the TV. She glanced up when Adrian entered, but quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. "Hey, Lyra," Adrian said softly, approaching her. "How are you doing?" She shrugged, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Same as always." Adrian sat down on the edge of the couch, studying her. "I came to check on you. I wanted to see how things are going here." Lyra snorted. "Yeah, well, this place is just like all the others. Doesn't matter where I am. It's all the same." Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. "I don't belong anywhere. It's like I'm just waiting for the next person to come along and pass me to someone else." Her words hit Adrian hard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He could see how deeply the foster system had scarred her, how every placement, every move, had chipped away at her sense of belonging. "I'm not going to pass you off, Lyra," Adrian said firmly, breaking the silence. "I'm here. I want to help." Lyra didn't answer right away. When she finally did speak, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "We'll see." A few days after visiting Lyra's foster home, Adrian invited her to his house for dinner. He hoped that by spending time together outside of the formalities of court or foster care meetings, they could start building some kind of connection. Lyra showed up looking skeptical, her arms crossed as she stepped into Adrian's modest home. The house was neat and orderly, with minimalist decor that spoke to Adrian's need for control and routine. But tonight, it felt warmer, like a place that could be lived in, rather than just inhabited. "You cook?" Lyra asked, her tone carrying a hint of sarcasm as she eyed the kitchen. "I try," Adrian replied with a small smile, gesturing for her to sit at the table. "I made spaghetti. Thought it was a safe choice." Lyra smirked. "Safe for you, maybe." Adrian chuckled as he set the plates down, watching her cautiously. They ate in relative silence for a while, but slowly, the tension began to ease. Lyra started to ask small questions, about his job, about the house, and Adrian answered them honestly, without trying to pry too much into her world. After dinner, they sat in the living room, the air between them lighter than it had been before. Adrian could see that Lyra was still guarded, but there was a small shift, like a crack in the wall she had built around herself. "Thanks for dinner," she said quietly, almost awkwardly. Adrian nodded. "You're welcome here anytime, Lyra." She didn't respond, but for the first time, she didn't look away. The results came on a quiet morning. Adrian sat at his desk, the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of it. His heart pounded as he slowly opened it, pulling out the neatly folded paper inside. He scanned the document, his eyes landing on the key line. Probability of paternity, 0%. Adrian's stomach dropped. The test confirmed what he had suspected but had been afraid to admit to himself. Lyra wasn't his biological daughter. He sat back in his chair, the paper still in his hand, staring at the words. He had prepared himself for this possibility, but now that it was real, it felt like a blow. But as the initial shock faded, something else took its place, resolve. The test didn't change how he felt about Lyra. It didn't change his promise to Sarah or the responsibility he felt for the girl who had been through so much. Adrian set the paper aside and took a deep breath. Lyra wasn't his biological daughter. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what he chose to do now. and he had already made his choice. The DNA results sat on the desk, a silent reminder of the reality that Lyra wasn't his biological daughter. But as Adrian sat in his office, staring at the paper, he knew it didn't change anything. He had made his decision. Whether Lyra was his by blood or not didn't matter. What mattered was that she needed someone, and Sarah had trusted him to be that someone. Later that afternoon, he arranged to meet Lyra at the courthouse. She arrived with her usual guarded expression, arms crossed tightly as she walked into his office. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her tone defensive, as if she was bracing herself for bad news. Adrian gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, eyeing him warily. He could feel the tension between them, the fear she hid behind sarcasm and indifference. "I got the results," Adrian said quietly. Lyra's face hardened. "Yeah? What do they say?" Adrian hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "The test says I'm not your biological father." He watched her closely, but Lyra didn't flinch. Instead, she gave a small, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course it does," she muttered, her voice low. "Figures." Adrian leaned forward in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. "But that doesn't change anything. I want you to understand that." Lyra frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm not walking away, Lyra," Adrian said firmly. "The results don't matter to me. I promised your mother I'd be there for you, and I intend to keep that promise." Lyra stared at him, her defenses faltering. For a moment, she didn't seem to know what to say. Then she shook her head again, though her voice wavered. "You don't have to do this." "I know I don't," Adrian replied softly. "But I want to." Lyra looked away, her arms tightening around herself. Adrian could see the battle going on inside her, the war between her desire to trust him and the fear of being hurt again. "Why?" she asked after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you want to help me? You don't owe me anything." Adrian took a deep breath. "Because I care about you, Lyra. You deserve a chance to have a stable life. And because Sarah wanted me to take care of you. I couldn't do that for her when she was alive, but I can now." For the first time, Lyra's tough exterior seemed to crack, and she blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She quickly turned away, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Yeah, well, don't get your hopes up," she muttered, her voice thick. "People always say that, but they never stick around." Adrian's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't let the sadness show on his face. He had to be strong for her, even if she didn't believe him yet. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "You'll see." The next few weeks passed in a blur as Adrian began the process of gaining legal custody of Lyra. It wasn't as simple as he had hoped. There were obstacles at every turn, and the courts weren't quick to allow a judge, no matter his standing, to take custody of a foster child. Adrian knew he would have to fight for this, and that's exactly what he planned to do. One afternoon, he found himself in a meeting with his attorney, Grace Porter, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had handled many custody cases before. They sat in her office, the table between them covered in documents and legal forms. "You understand this isn't going to be an easy process, right?" Grace said, glancing at Adrian over the rim of her glasses. "Even with your position, the court will want to make sure this is in Lyra's best interest." "I understand," Adrian replied. "I just want to do what's best for her." Grace nodded. "Good. But be prepared, there's a chance this could get complicated. You know that Lyra's case file isn't straightforward. The foster system has been mishandling her situation for years, and now that you've entered the picture, we'll have to work through all of that. Not to mention, there could be other people who claim a stake in her future." Adrian frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Other people? Like who?" Grace glanced at the papers in front of her. "We don't know for sure, but there's always the possibility that someone else might come forward, a relative, maybe. Or someone from her past." The thought of someone else stepping in made Adrian's stomach twist. He had only just begun to form a fragile connection with Lyra. What if someone else tried to take her away? I don't want her to go through any more upheaval, Adrian said firmly. She's been bounced around enough. She needs stability. Grace gave him a sympathetic look. I know. And we'll do everything we can to make sure she gets that. But I just want you to be prepared for anything. Adrian nodded, though the weight of the legal battle ahead pressed heavily on his mind. He had already made his choice. He wasn't going to give up on Lyra. But now, he would have to prove to the court that he was the best option for her. As the legal process dragged on, Adrian noticed that Lyra had grown more distant. She still came to his house for dinners and occasionally talked to him, but there was a tension between them that hadn't been there before. It was as if she was pulling back, retreating into herself once again. One evening, after another quiet meal, Adrian decided to address the issue head-on. Lyra sat at the dining table, poking at her food with her fork, her eyes downcast. Adrian took a seat across from her, folding his hands on the table. Lyra, he began gently, is everything okay? She glanced up at him, her expression guarded as always. Yeah, why? You've been distant, Adrian said carefully. I just want to make sure you're doing all right with everything that's going on. Lyra shrugged, her voice flat. It's whatever. I'm used to things not working out. Adrian frowned. What do you mean? She set down her fork, her eyes hardening. I mean, this whole thing, you trying to get custody of me. I've been through this before. People say they're going to help, but they never do. It always falls apart. Her words hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. He could hear the pain behind them, the years of disappointment and broken promises that had shaped her view of the world. I'm not going to let that happen, Adrian said firmly. I know it's hard to trust after everything you've been through, but I'm not going to let you down. Lyra scoffed, leaning back in her chair. Yeah, well, you don't know that. The courts could decide something else, and then I'll just get sent off again. Adrian leaned forward, his voice steady. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. I'm fighting for you, Lyra. And I'm not going to stop. For a moment, Lyra just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she pushed her chair back abruptly and stood up. Yeah, well, good luck with that, she muttered, heading for the door. I've learned not to get my hopes up. Adrian watched her go, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He wanted to reach her, to break through the walls she had built, but he knew it would take time. She had been hurt too many times before to believe in promises. The next morning, Adrian received an unexpected phone call from Miss Carter, Lyra's social worker. He hadn't heard much from her since their last meeting, and the call took him by surprise. Judge Hale, Miss Carter's voice crackled over the line, I wanted to talk to you about Lyra's case. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his curiosity piqued. What about it? Well, I've been thinking, Miss Carter continued, her tone more hesitant than usual. Lyra's been through a lot. And I've seen how she is with you. It's rare to see her start to open up to someone. Adrian's heart lifted slightly at her words. You think she's opening up to me? I do, Miss Carter replied. It's small, but it's there. And honestly, I think you're the best shot she has at finding stability. I want to help. Adrian blinked in surprise. You want to help? Miss Carter chuckled softly. I know, shocking, right? But yes. I've seen too many kids like Lyra slip through the cracks, and I don't want that to happen again. If you're serious about gaining custody, I'll do whatever I can to support you in the process. Adrian felt a wave of relief wash over him. Having Miss Carter's support would make a significant difference, especially with the courts. Thank you, he said sincerely. I appreciate that more than you know. A few weeks later, Adrian sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest as the judge read through the case files. Lyra sat beside him, her expression blank, though Adrian could see the tension in the way she clenched her fists in her lap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up. Based on the evidence presented and the recommendation of Miss Carter, I'm granting Judge Hale temporary custody of Lyra Carter. Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, a sense of triumph surging through him. Temporary custody wasn't the end of the road, but it was a step in the right direction. Lyra could finally leave the foster system and move into his home. As they left the courtroom, Adrian glanced at Lyra, who was walking beside him with her usual guarded expression. But when she caught his eye, there was the faintest hint of relief in her gaze. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice almost incredulous. Adrian smiled softly. "We did it." For the first time, Lyra didn't look away. Adrian stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, watching as Lyra slowly stepped inside. The room had been sparsely furnished for years, just a bed and a small dresser, but now it was going to be hers. The walls were painted a soft, neutral color, and the window let in the late afternoon light, casting a warm glow over the space. Lyra didn't say much as she looked around. She stood near the bed, running her hand along the plain comforter, her expression unreadable. "You can change anything you want," Adrian said from the doorway. "We can paint the walls, get new furniture. Whatever will make it feel more like yours." Lyra turned to him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You don't have to do that." "I want you to feel comfortable here," Adrian replied, stepping further into the room. "This is your space now. You should make it your own." Lyra shrugged, still keeping her distance. "I've never really had my own space before. Not like this." Adrian's heart sank at her words. The idea of a stable, personal space was foreign to her, just another reminder of how much she had been through. "Well, you do now," he said, offering her a small smile. "And I'm serious about painting. Any color you want." Lyra looked around the room again, this time with a little more interest. "What if I want to paint it black?" she asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Adrian chuckled. "If that's what you want, we can work something out." Lyra gave a half-smile, the tension between them easing just a little. "I'll think about it." They stood in silence for a few moments before Adrian spoke again, more softly this time. "I know this is new for you, and it might take time to get used to. But I want you to feel at home here. You're not just passing through." Lyra looked at him, her green eyes searching his face. She didn't respond right away, but Adrian could see the wheels turning in her mind. Trust didn't come easy to her, but maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. "Thanks," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded. "You're welcome." A few weeks had passed since Lyra had officially moved into Adrian's house. The adjustment had been gradual, but there were small signs of progress, like the way she had chosen a dark teal color for her bedroom walls and started leaving some of her things scattered around the house. Adrian took these as small victories, even though Lyra still kept most of her emotions guarded. But one afternoon, when Adrian came home from work, he noticed something was off. Lyra sat at the kitchen table, her backpack open beside her and several crumpled papers scattered across the table. She was glaring at one of her textbooks, frustration written all over her face. "Hey," Adrian greeted, dropping his keys on the counter. "How was school?" Lyra didn't look up. "Fine." Adrian frowned, sensing that something was wrong. He walked over to the table and glanced at the papers. One of them was a math quiz, and a large red D circled the top of the page. "You want to talk about it?" Adrian asked, nodding toward the quiz. Lyra's face flushed with embarrassment, and she quickly crumpled the paper in her hand, shoving it to the side. "It's nothing. I just suck at math." Adrian sat down across from her, his expression softening. "It's okay. You're not supposed to be good at everything right away. Especially with everything you've been through." Lyra clenched her jaw, clearly frustrated with herself. "It's not just math. I'm behind in almost every subject. No one cared in the foster homes, and now I'm just lost." Adrian's chest tightened. He knew she had struggled with school, but hearing her admit it aloud made it even more real. She had been shuffled from home to home, and education had clearly taken a back seat to survival. Well, Adrian began gently, what if we get you a tutor? Someone who can help you catch up. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. A tutor? Yeah, Adrian said, nodding. We can find someone to help with the subjects you're struggling in. Or I could help you myself if you'd rather. Lyra hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. I don't need special treatment. I'm not stupid. I don't think you're stupid, Lyra, Adrian replied quickly. I just think you've had a lot to deal with, and it's okay to need some help. She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her textbook. I don't want people to think I can't handle it. Adrian leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. Asking for help doesn't mean you can't handle it. It means you're doing what you need to do to get stronger. For a long moment, Lyra didn't say anything. Then she gave a small nod, though she didn't meet his eyes. Okay. Maybe a tutor. Adrian smiled, relieved that she was at least willing to try. I'll look into it tomorrow. And if you want, we can go over some of this together tonight. Lyra glanced up at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You're not gonna, give up if I'm a total failure at this, right? Adrian shook his head, his expression serious. I'm not giving up on you, Lyra. Ever. She stared at him for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Okay. As Lyra settled into her new life with Adrian, there were moments when the barriers between them began to lower, if only for a brief time. One evening, while Adrian was working in his study, Lyra wandered into the room. She wasn't the type to ask for attention, but Adrian had learned to recognize the subtle ways she sought connection. What are you working on? She asked, leaning against the doorway. Just going over some case files, Adrian replied, looking up from his desk. Nothing too exciting. Lyra shrugged, stepping into the room. She glanced at the bookshelf, her eyes falling on a small collection of framed photos. One of the pictures, tucked near the back, caught her attention. It was an old photograph of Adrian and Sarah, taken years ago during a rare moment of happiness. Sarah was laughing, her auburn curls wild in the wind, and Adrian was smiling beside her. Lyra reached for the photo, lifting it gently from the shelf. Is this my mom? Adrian's heart skipped a beat as he watched her hold the frame. He hadn't intended for Lyra to find the photo, but now that she had, he couldn't avoid the conversation. Yeah, Adrian said softly. That's your mom. Lyra stared at the picture for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. She looks happy. She was, Adrian replied, his voice thick with emotion. At least, in that moment. Lyra sat down in the chair across from his desk, still holding the photo. What was she like? I mean, before she got sick. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting back to memories he hadn't revisited in years. She was vibrant. Full of life. She loved art, music, anything creative. She could find beauty in the simplest things. Lyra listened quietly, her eyes never leaving the photograph. I don't remember much about her. It feels like everything before she got sick is just blurry. Adrian nodded, understanding the pain in her voice. That's normal. You were young, and a lot happened so fast. But your mom loved you more than anything. She talked about you all the time. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Did she talk about you? Adrian smiled sadly. Sometimes. But I think she didn't want to burden you with those memories. She wanted you to have a future, not be stuck in the past. Lyra set the photo down on the desk, her shoulders slumping slightly. I wish I could have known her better. Adrian reached across the desk, placing a hand on the photo. You can still know her, Lyra. Through the stories, the memories. She's a part of you. Lyra stared at the photo for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. Yeah. Maybe. A few days later, Adrian decided to take Lyra on a surprise trip to the local museum. He remembered Sarah's love for art and thought it might be a good way to connect with Lyra, to show her a piece of her mother's world. As they walked through the museum's halls, Lyra remained quiet but visibly intrigued. She paused in front of several exhibits, studying them closely. One display, an architectural exhibit, caught her attention for longer than the others. She stood in front of a towering model of a futuristic building, her eyes wide with fascination. "This is cool," she muttered, almost to herself. Adrian smiled, stepping up beside her. "Do you like architecture?" Lyra shrugged, though her gaze remained fixed on the model. "I don't know. I guess it's interesting." Adrian watched her carefully. "You know, your mom used to love coming here. She always found inspiration in places like this." Lyra's expression softened, though she kept her eyes on the model. "I didn't know that." They moved through the exhibit in comfortable silence, and for the first time, Adrian felt like they were sharing something beyond the weight of their pasts. As they stood together, admiring the beauty of creation and possibility, Adrian felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was what Lyra needed, not just stability, but inspiration. A future to dream about, beyond the pain of her past. That evening, after they returned home, Lyra disappeared into her room for a while. When she emerged, she held a small sketchbook in her hands, her expression unreadable. She walked over to Adrian, who was sitting on the couch, and handed it to him without a word. Adrian looked down at the sketchbook, then back up at Lyra. "What's this?" Lyra shifted awkwardly. "It's something I've been working on. I don't know if it's any good, but I wanted you to see it." Adrian opened the sketchbook and felt his breath catch in his throat. The drawing on the first page was a simple, but beautifully rendered image of Adrian and Sarah, standing together, smiling. It was based on the photograph Lyra had found, but there was something more, an emotional depth that he hadn't seen in the original photo. Lyra had captured the connection between them, even if she hadn't witnessed it herself. Adrian looked up, his eyes meeting Lyra's. "This is incredible, Lyra. Truly." Lyra shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's just a drawing." "No," Adrian said, shaking his head. "It's more than that." For the first time, Adrian saw a flicker of pride in her eyes, and he realized how much this small gesture meant. She was opening up, little by little, and this drawing was her way of reaching out, of showing that she cared. "Thank you," Adrian said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra gave a small, shy smile. "You're welcome." The smell of roasted chicken filled the house, and Adrian was just finishing setting the table when the doorbell rang. Lyra sat at the kitchen counter, idly scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging the sound. "That'll be Miss Carter," Adrian said, glancing at Lyra as he wiped his hands on a towel. He had invited her social worker over for dinner, hoping to talk about Lyra's case and future. More than that, though, he wanted Miss Carter to see how far Lyra had come in the few months she had been living with him. Lyra didn't look up from her phone. "Great," she muttered. "Another night of people talking about me like I'm not here." Adrian walked over and leaned on the counter beside her. "I promise this isn't just about your case. I thought it'd be nice to have her over, talk about how things are going, maybe celebrate how well you've been doing lately." Lyra raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a half-smile. "Celebrate what? That I haven't burned the house down yet?" Adrian chuckled. "You've done a lot more than that, and you know it." Lyra shrugged but didn't argue. Adrian took it as a small victory. There were moments like this, brief flashes of humor and lightness, where he could see the walls around her starting to crack. She was still guarded, still wary of trusting too much, but she was letting him in, slowly. The doorbell rang again, and Adrian went to answer it. Miss Carter greeted him with a warm smile as she stepped inside, carrying a bottle of wine. "Thank you for inviting me," she said as Adrian closed the door behind her. "I've been meaning to check in on both of you." Adrian smiled. "You're always welcome here." They moved to the dining room, and Lyra reluctantly joined them at the table. She sat down without saying much, her eyes darting between Adrian and Miss Carter as they made small talk. Adrian could sense her discomfort. She hated feeling like she was being watched, judged, but he hoped that tonight would help ease some of her fears. "So, Lyra," Miss Carter said as she took a bite of her salad, "how's school going? Adrian tells me you've been doing well." Lyra shrugged, poking at her food with her fork. "It's fine, I guess. I've got a tutor now, so that helps." "That's great to hear," Miss Carter replied. "I know you've had a rough time with school in the past, but it sounds like you're starting to catch up." Lyra didn't respond right away, but Adrian could see the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. She glanced at him, then back at Miss Carter. "Yeah. It's better now. I'm trying." Adrian smiled softly. "You're doing more than just trying, Lyra. You're doing great." Lyra gave a small, awkward smile in return, but quickly looked down at her plate. Miss Carter caught Adrian's eye and nodded subtly, acknowledging the progress they both could see. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. As the dinner continued, Adrian and Miss Carter talked more about the legal side of things, how the process of gaining permanent custody was moving forward, and what the next steps would be. Lyra didn't say much, but she was listening. Adrian could tell by the way her eyes flicked to them whenever the conversation shifted to her. When the meal ended, Lyra excused herself and went upstairs to her room. Miss Carter lingered at the table with Adrian, sipping her wine thoughtfully. "She's come a long way," Miss Carter said, setting her glass down. "You've done a great job with her." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy. Sometimes I feel like she's still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like she's testing me, just to see if I'll walk away." Miss Carter nodded. "That's normal, especially for someone who's been through what she has. It'll take time for her to fully trust that you're not going anywhere." Adrian sighed. "I just want her to believe that she's safe here." "She's starting to," Miss Carter said gently. "You're doing everything right, Adrian. Just keep being patient. She needs that." Adrian smiled, though the weight of the road ahead still pressed on him. He knew Miss Carter was right, but he also knew that Lyra's journey toward trust was far from over. The following week, just as Adrian was settling into the idea of a smoother path forward, his world was shaken by an unexpected development. He was in his chambers, going over case files, when his secretary knocked on the door and poked her head in. "Judge Hale," she said, "there's a man here to see you. Says his name is Marcus Whitman, and it's about Lyra Carter." Adrian's blood ran cold at the name. Marcus Whitman, the man Sarah had mentioned briefly in her letters, a shadow from her past. He hadn't given much thought to him until now, but hearing that name in connection to Lyra sent a ripple of unease through him. "Send him in," Adrian said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. Moments later, a wiry man in his 50s entered the room. His features were weathered, his sunken cheeks and sharp brown eyes giving him a hard, almost predatory look. His clothes were wrinkled, as though he'd been living on the edge for a while. "Judge Hale," Marcus said, his voice rough but confident. "I've been looking forward to this meeting." Adrian gestured for him to sit, his eyes narrowing. "What's this about?" Marcus sat down, leaning back casually in his chair, his eyes flicking around the office before landing back on Adrian. "It's about Lyra." Adrian's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What about her?" Marcus smiled, a thin, unsettling smile. "I'm her father." Adrian's chest tightened. He had feared something like this might happen, but hearing the words out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "You've been out of her life for years," Adrian said, his voice cold. "Why now?" Marcus shrugged, his smile fading. "Things were complicated back then. But I've been thinking about her a lot lately. I figured it was time I stepped up and took responsibility." Adrian leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You expect me to believe that? After all this time?" Marcus's eyes darkened, the casual facade slipping for a moment. "I'm her blood. That's what matters." Adrian's hands clenched into fists under the desk, but he kept his voice calm. Blood doesn't make you a father. Being there does. And you weren't. Marcus's smile returned, though there was a coldness behind it now. Maybe. But I'm back now, and I've got every right to be in her life. Adrian stood up, his jaw tight. You haven't earned that right. Marcus stood as well, his expression hardening. We'll see about that, won't we? Without another word, Marcus turned and walked out of the office, leaving Adrian standing there, the weight of his threat hanging in the air. The courtroom was filled with tension as Adrian and Marcus sat on opposite sides, waiting for the judge to call their case. Adrian's heart pounded as he glanced over at Marcus, who sat with an air of smug confidence, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. Lyra sat beside Adrian, her expression blank, though Adrian could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes. She hadn't said much since Marcus's arrival, but her silence spoke volumes. This was a nightmare for her, the return of someone who had been nothing but a shadow in her life, now threatening to take away the only stability she had known. The judge finally called their case, and the hearing began. Marcus's lawyer presented his case first, arguing that as Lyra's biological father, Marcus had a right to be involved in her life. He painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes in the past, but was now trying to make amends. Adrian's stomach churned as he listened, his mind racing with thoughts of what this could mean for Lyra. She didn't need someone like Marcus in her life, someone who had abandoned her, who hadn't been there when she needed him most. When it was Adrian's turn, his lawyer made a strong case, emphasizing the bond Adrian had formed with Lyra over the past months, the stability he had provided, and the fact that Lyra had no real relationship with Marcus. But the moment that mattered most came when Lyra was asked to speak. She stood in front of the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the judge. Lyra, the judge said gently, this is about your future. I want to hear from you. What do you want? Lyra swallowed hard, her eyes flicking toward Adrian, then back at the judge. Her voice was small but steady as she spoke. I don't really know Marcus, she said, her words careful. He wasn't there when I needed him. But Adrian's been there for me. He's the one who's taken care of me, who's made me feel like I belong somewhere. Her voice wavered, and for a moment, she hesitated, as if unsure of whether to continue. Then she took a deep breath and spoke with more strength. I want to stay with Adrian. He's my family now. Adrian felt a surge of emotion at her words, his heart swelling with pride and relief. Lyra had chosen him. Despite everything she had been through, despite her fear of being abandoned again, she had chosen to trust him. The judge listened carefully, then nodded. Thank you, Lyra. As she sat back down beside Adrian, he reached over and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She didn't pull away. After the hearing, they walked out of the courthouse together. Marcus had stormed off with his lawyer, clearly furious that things hadn't gone his way. But Adrian didn't care about Marcus. He only cared about Lyra, and the fact that she had chosen to stay with him. As they reached the car, Lyra hesitated, her eyes downcast. Adrian stopped beside her, sensing that she had something on her mind. Lyra, he said softly, you did great in there. Lyra glanced up at him, her expression uncertain. Yeah. I guess. Adrian frowned. What's wrong? Lyra shrugged, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. I thought I'd feel better now that it's over. But I don't. Adrian's heart ached for her. He knew this wasn't just about the hearing, it was about the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being unwanted. Lyra, Adrian said gently, it's okay to feel that way. You've been through a lot. But you're not alone anymore. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm scared, Adrian. What if something happens and you decide you don't want me anymore? Adrian's chest tightened at her words. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. That's never going to happen, Lyra. I'm not going anywhere. I chose you, just like you chose me. For a moment, Lyra didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Okay," she whispered. Adrian smiled softly. "Let's go home." The quiet of the evening was only interrupted by the soft rustle of paper as Adrian sat at his desk, sifting through the documents from Lyra's custody case. He had thought the battle for custody was nearing its end, but Marcus's sudden appearance had cast a shadow over everything. Marcus wasn't going away easily, and Adrian knew he needed more than just legal arguments to win. He needed to find the truth, the full story of Sarah's life after they had parted ways. Adrian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind kept circling back to the letters Sarah had written but never sent. There had to be something more in those letters, something that could explain her relationship with Marcus, and why she had never mentioned him to Adrian. He pulled the stack of letters from the drawer and began reading again, more carefully this time. The words, written in Sarah's familiar handwriting, carried a weight that he hadn't fully appreciated before. As he read through each letter, a pattern started to emerge, small, cryptic mentions of a difficult time and references to people Adrian didn't recognize. And then, buried in one of the later letters, Adrian found a name, Marcus. It wasn't much, just a fleeting mention, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. Sarah had known Marcus long before Adrian had entered her life. And from the way she wrote about him, it was clear that their relationship had been complicated, even troubled. Adrian's heart pounded as he scanned the rest of the letter, hoping for more clues. There was nothing explicit, but the tone of Sarah's writing was enough to make Adrian suspect that Marcus hadn't been a positive presence in her life. She had been scared, unsure of how to handle the situation. He set the letter down, his mind racing. If Marcus had been part of Sarah's life, why hadn't he come forward sooner? And more importantly, what kind of role had he really played in her final years? Adrian stood up from his desk, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to fit together. He needed answers. And the only way to get them was to confront Marcus head-on. The next morning, Adrian tracked Marcus down to the address listed in his court file. It was a dingy apartment building on the edge of town, the kind of place that seemed to mirror the chaos Marcus brought with him. Adrian stood outside the door for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before knocking. It took a few seconds, but eventually, the door creaked open, and Marcus appeared, looking just as disheveled as before. His eyes narrowed when he saw Adrian. Well, Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Adrian didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk." Marcus smirked, crossing his arms. "About what?" "How you're trying to steal my daughter." Adrian's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This isn't about you or me. It's about what's best for Lyra." Marcus scoffed. "What's best for Lyra? You think you know what's best for her? You've known her for what, 6 months? I've known her whole life." Adrian stepped closer, his voice low. "Then why weren't you there when she needed you? Why did Sarah never mention you in her will and her plans for Lyra's future?" Marcus's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That's none of your business. I had my reasons." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "I've read the letters, Marcus. Sarah was scared of you, wasn't she? She didn't trust you." Marcus's smirk faded completely, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "You don't know what you're talking about." Adrian pressed on, his voice steady. "I know enough. Sarah didn't want you involved in Lyra's life. She knew you were trouble." Marcus's face twisted with anger, and he took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You don't know anything about Sarah. She was mine long before you came along. She loved me, even if she didn't want to admit it." Adrian stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "If she loved you so much, why did she choose me to take care of her daughter? Why did she want me to be the one to protect Lyra?" Marcus's eyes blazed with fury, but he didn't have an answer. Instead, he shoved past Adrian, storming out of the apartment and down the stairs. Adrian watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: Marcus wasn't in Lyra's life for the right reasons. And Adrian wasn't going to let him hurt her any more than he already had. That evening, Adrian returned home, his mind still racing with everything that had happened. He knew he needed to tell Lyra what he had discovered about Marcus, but the thought of shattering her already fragile trust was almost too much to bear. He found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded as always. "Hey," she said quietly, closing the book. "You've been gone all day." Adrian hesitated, unsure of how to start. "I needed to look into some things about your case." "About Marcus?" Lyra's eyes darkened at the mention of his name. "What about him?" Adrian sat down beside her, choosing his words carefully. "I went to see him today." Lyra's face tightened, and she pulled her knees up to her chest, clearly bracing herself for what was coming. "I wanted to find out more about him," Adrian continued gently. "About his relationship with your mom." Lyra's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "What did he say?" Adrian took a deep breath. "He wasn't honest, Lyra. He hasn't been honest from the start. Your mom didn't trust him. She was scared of him." Lyra's breath hitched, and she shook her head. "No. That's not true." "I'm sorry, Lyra," Adrian said softly. "But I've read the letters. Your mom wrote about him, about how she didn't want him in your life." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and she stood up abruptly, turning away from him. "You don't know what you're talking about. You didn't know her. You didn't know what she wanted." "Lyra," Adrian said, his voice pained, "I know this is hard to hear, but I need you to understand. Your mom wanted to protect you." Lyra spun around, her eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "Then why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she warn me about him?" Adrian stood up, reaching out for her, but she backed away, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't she tell me?" she shouted, her voice cracking with pain. Adrian's heart broke at the sight of her, but he didn't have an answer. He didn't know why Sarah had kept so many secrets from her daughter, and now it was tearing Lyra apart. "I don't know," Adrian said quietly. "But I do know that she loved you. Everything she did, everything she wanted, was for you." Lyra shook her head, her sobs choking her words. "I don't believe you. I don't believe any of it." She turned and ran upstairs, slamming the door to her room behind her. Adrian stood in the middle of the living room, feeling utterly helpless. The next morning, Adrian received a phone call that would change everything. Marcus had been arrested. The charges weren't related to Lyra, but they were serious enough to threaten his chances of ever gaining custody. Adrian drove to the police station to confront Marcus one last time. When he arrived, he was led to a small, dimly lit room where Marcus sat in handcuffs, his expression cold and defiant. "You're done, Marcus," Adrian said, his voice filled with quiet anger. "You're not going to hurt Lyra anymore." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You think this changes anything? She's still my daughter." "She's not your daughter," Adrian shot back, his eyes blazing. "You abandoned her. You abandoned Sarah. You never cared about either of them." Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You don't know anything about what happened between me and Sarah." Adrian stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I know enough. And now the courts know too. You're never going to get near Lyra again." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. He knew Adrian was right. There was nothing left for him to say. Adrian turned and walked out of the room, leaving Marcus behind for good. That night, after everything that had happened, Adrian sat down with Lyra in the living room. She was still angry, still hurt, but she had stopped running from him. She sat beside him on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red from crying. "I talked to Marcus," Adrian said softly. "He's not going to be in your life anymore." Lyra didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. I know this has been hard for you, Adrian continued, his voice filled with emotion. And I know you've been carrying a lot of pain. But I want you to know that you're safe now. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Why are you still here? Adrian's heart ached at the question. Because I care about you, Lyra. You're part of my life now, and that's not going to change. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a small, fragile voice. I'm scared. Adrian reached out and gently took her hand. I know. But you don't have to be scared anymore. We're going to get through this together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra didn't pull away. She let him hold her hand, and though her walls were still up, Adrian could feel them starting to crack. I'm here, Adrian whispered, his voice steady and sure. And I'm not going anywhere. The courtroom was quiet, almost eerily so, as Adrian and Lyra sat side by side, waiting for the judge to deliver the final decision. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with everything that had led them to this moment. Marcus was no longer a threat, his arrest had sealed his fate, but there were still legal hurdles to clear before Adrian could gain full custody of Lyra. Lyra sat beside him, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She hadn't said much that morning, and Adrian could tell she was anxious. The uncertainty of what lay ahead still weighed heavily on her, despite everything they had been through. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. As they sat back down, Adrian shot a quick glance at Lyra. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of calm, but Adrian could see the tension in her posture, the way she clenched her hands in her lap. After reviewing all evidence and testimonies, the judge began, her voice echoing through the room, I have come to a decision regarding the custody of Lyra Carter. Adrian held his breath, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Given the circumstances surrounding Marcus Whitman's arrest, and the testimony provided by both the child and her guardian, I find that it is in Lyra's best interest to remain in the custody of Judge Adrian Hale. Adrian exhaled, a rush of relief flooding his chest. He glanced at Lyra, who was staring at the judge, wide-eyed, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am granting Adrian Hale full and permanent custody of Lyra Carter, effective immediately. Lyra's mouth opened slightly in shock, and she turned to look at Adrian, her green eyes searching his face for reassurance. Adrian gave her a small, reassuring smile. It's official, Lyra. You're staying with me. Lyra blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the words. She looked back at the judge, then at Adrian again. For a moment, it seemed like she wasn't sure how to react. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, small at first, but growing wider as the reality of what had just happened sunk in. Adrian's heart swelled at the sight of her smile. It was the first time he had seen such pure joy on her face, untainted by fear or doubt. The judge banged her gavel, signaling the end of the hearing. As people began to rise from their seats and file out of the courtroom, Lyra remained seated, still processing everything. Come on, Adrian said softly, standing up and offering her his hand. Let's go home. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, and Adrian could feel the strength behind it, the strength of someone who had fought her way through so much and had finally found a place where she belonged. A few days after the final hearing, Adrian and Lyra made the drive out to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. It was a peaceful spot, nestled on a hillside just outside the city, surrounded by trees and wildflowers. The air was cool, the sky overcast, but there was a quiet serenity to the place that felt comforting. They walked together in silence, the gravel crunching under their feet as they approached Sarah's grave. Adrian had brought a bouquet of flowers, sunflowers, Sarah's favorite, and placed them gently at the base of the headstone. Lyra stood beside him, her hands in the pockets of her jacket, staring at the simple granite marker. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and a bird chirped in the distance. Adrian wasn't sure if Lyra was ready to talk about her mother yet, but he didn't push her. He knew this moment was as much about closure as it was about healing. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Lyra broke the silence. I wish I could remember more about her, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like she's just fading away. Adrian's heart ached at her words. He had his own memories of Sarah, bright and vivid, but he knew that Lyra's memories were different. They were clouded by time, by loss, and by the pain of growing up without her. You don't have to remember everything, Adrian said gently. She's still a part of you. She always will be. Lyra looked down at the grave, her expression thoughtful. Do you think she'd be happy? I mean, with us? Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. I think she'd be really proud of you, Lyra. And I think she'd be happy knowing you found a place where you belong. Lyra's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded slowly. I miss her. I know, Adrian said softly. I miss her too. They stood together in silence for a few more minutes, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Then, without a word, Lyra knelt down and placed her hand on the headstone, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of her mother's name. Thanks, Mom, she whispered. For everything. Adrian's throat tightened at the sight of her, and he had to blink back tears. This moment, this small gesture, felt like the beginning of something new, something hopeful. After a few more moments, Lyra stood up and turned to Adrian, her eyes bright with emotion. Let's go home, she said, her voice steady. Adrian smiled and nodded. Let's go. The house felt different after the final hearing, as if a weight had been lifted from the air. There was a sense of permanence now, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. Adrian could see it in the way Lyra moved around the house, more comfortable, more at ease. She no longer treated it like a temporary stopover, but like a place where she could truly settle in. One afternoon, as Adrian sat in his study working on some case files, Lyra appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. Hey, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Got a minute? Adrian looked up from his desk, surprised by her casual tone. Of course. What's up? Lyra walked into the room, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. I was thinking, now that everything's official and stuff, maybe we could, set up some kind of routine. You know, like normal families do. Adrian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A routine? What kind of routine? Lyra shrugged, though there was a hint of excitement in her voice. I don't know. Maybe we could have, a movie night once a week or something. And I was thinking, I could help out around the house more. I mean, I know I haven't exactly been the easiest person to live with. Adrian smiled warmly. You've been doing just fine, Lyra. But I like the idea of a routine. And a movie night sounds great. Lyra's smile widened, and for the first time, Adrian saw a glimpse of the girl she might have been, before the foster homes, before the abandonment, before the pain. She was still there, underneath all the layers of hurt and mistrust, waiting to be fully seen. Cool, Lyra said, her voice brightening. We can start this Friday. I'll pick the movie. Adrian chuckled. I'm looking forward to it. Lyra lingered in the room for a moment, as if unsure of whether to say more. Then, after a brief pause, she looked at him with a seriousness that caught him off guard. Thanks, she said quietly. For everything. Adrian's heart swelled, and he stood up, walking over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to thank me, Lyra. We're in this together. Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Yeah. We are. As the weeks passed, Lyra began to open up more, not just to Adrian but to the possibilities of her future. One evening, they were sitting at the dining table, finishing up dinner, when Adrian noticed her sketchbook lying open beside her plate. It was filled with intricate designs, buildings, landscapes, and structures that seemed almost futuristic in their complexity. These are amazing, Adrian said, flipping through the pages. You've got real talent, Lyra. Lyra blushed slightly, looking down at her hands. It's just something I do when I'm bored. Adrian shook his head. No, it's more than that. You've got a real eye for design. Have you ever thought about what you want to do with this? Lyra hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. I mean, I've thought about being an architect, but that's probably just a stupid dream. Adrian frowned. Why would you think that? Lyra glanced at him, her expression guarded. Because people like me don't get to have big dreams. I've spent most of my life just trying to survive. Adrian's heart ached at her words. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. You can be anything you want to be, Lyra. Don't let your past define your future. If architecture is what you want to do, I'll do everything I can to help you get there. Lyra stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Maybe I will, she said softly. Maybe I'll design the tallest building in the world. Adrian grinned. I have no doubt you will. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Adrian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but sitting beside Lyra, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. Lyra leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on the armrests. I used to think I'd never have a real family, she said quietly. But I guess I was wrong. Adrian looked at her, his chest tightening with emotion. You're not alone anymore, Lyra. You have a family now. And I'm not going anywhere. Lyra smiled softly, her eyes glistening in the fading light. Yeah. I know. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow, Adrian felt the weight of the past lift away. They had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, but in the end, it wasn't blood that made them family. It was the choice to stay, to fight, and to belong. For the first time in years, Adrian felt truly at peace. And as he sat there beside Lyra, he knew that this moment of quiet, shared belonging, was what family was all about.